So many humanoid stat blocks have been shredded from the D&D 2025 Monster Manual. Goblins, kobolds, and Gith have all become Fae, dragons, and aberrations. And Drow, Duragar, and very famously at this point, Orcs have all been booted from the book entirely. But what does this mean for your D&D game, where a warlike nation of evildoers are the overarching villains? Who fills the role of disposable combat fodder now? My name's Ben Byrne, and this is how to make orcs and other humanoids formidable in your D&D game. I've been pretty reluctant to do a monstrous humanoids formidable video, exactly because of the tension in the hobby right now around whether all orcs are or should be evil. Then Wizards of the Coast changed everything by redefining what a humanoid is in 2024. Humanoids. There are no longer any humanoid stat blocks in the new Monster Manual, which are defined by their species. Every single one has either been moved to another creature type, or the humanoid stat blocks that are there are more like class descriptions now. For example, a guard captain, a performer, or a questing knight. The suggestion is that any one of those stat blocks could be from any playable species that are included in the 2024 Player's Handbook. One of the biggest complaints about this is, won't all humanoids just feel identical to encounter now in the game, regardless of their species or culture? Well, maybe, but to be honest, we've never had stat blocks for High Elves, Dragonborn, Halflings, or Tieflings in the 2014 5e. No orcs. So the absence of orcs or drow in the 2024 Monster Manual isn't that surprising, and at least in my opinion, it's not that much of a downgrade. In fact, if you exclude the stat blocks that had their creature type changed to something else like goblins and Gith, the 2024 Monster Manual actually has more humanoid stat blocks than the previous one did. So there's actually been a net gain in the variety of humanoid villains for your party to fight against. It's a far cry from all humanoids feeling the same. That said, I will concede it is immersive when a drow knight and an orcish knight feel different to encounter. You can still make that happen with this one easy trick. Add the species traits from the Player's Handbook to the NPC stat blocks of your villains to reflect their heritage and make them feel like unique combatants. Give a drow questing knight dark vision, Fey ancestry, and the darkness spell, while you can give an orc questing knight dark vision, adrenaline rush, and relentless endurance. Add draconic ancestry and all its benefits to a guard captain stat block to create a really fearsome dragonborn leader of the city's watch. Maybe this advice should be in the new Monster Manual, but I've been doing it since I started GMing years ago, and I think that the discourse on this book is a little too focused on what it lacks without acknowledging what it has. For example, there are now over 5 different cultist stat blocks which reflect a variety of deities for your cult to worship. We now have 2 nobles, knights, scouts, and spies. And there are 3 different performer stat blocks and 3 warriors, which includes a CR10 warrior commander to lead your fearsome warlike peoples. There's more variety of humanoids in this Monster Manual than there was in 2014, and honestly, the reason Wizards of the Coast made these changes to humanoids are not what you think they are. There's been a couple videos on YouTube recently trying to define what personhood is in a fantasy world. And without falling into the philosophy of it all here, the answer is really just that it depends on the setting that you're playing in. Orcs are ravenous, fungal monsters in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. But in the Elder Scrolls, the depiction of orcs is much more sophisticated and their personhood is much less questioned. D&D is simply moving in that Elder Scrolls direction. By including orcs and drow as playable humanoid species and excluding them from the Monster Manual, the lore of D&D is telling us that they're people, not monsters. By contrast, goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears are not humanoids. Goblins are Fae. They're capricious, fey creatures who each embody the dangers and fears of the wilderness. Goblins are described as the embodiments of recklessness and ruin, who delight in wreckage. In the lore of D&D, they're now closer to a fairy than they are a person. You might not like that change, but it's actually, mythologically speaking, probably more accurate for as much as there is accuracy in mythology. Notice that this change in humanoids is also about world building. Drow could have also been changed to a fey creature and embody the cold darkness of the wilderness, maybe being closer to the dark elves of Norse mythology. Drow are a popular player species, so wizards chose to make them humanoids. Gith are aberrations, alien minds from beyond the known world, and lycanthropes have become monstrosities because they lose their humanity when they become cursed. And as I've said in all our Formidable Monsters videos, monsters are meant to embody themes, types of horror and story genres that you use to build the sort of campaign you want to when you choose those monsters. Humanoids are the we who experience those conflicts when confronted by monsters. But there's also mechanical changes here to consider. Certain spells and rules in D&D affect specific creature types differently. It's been well noted at this point that Charmed Person has technically received a nerf in 2024 D&D because it doesn't affect Gith or goblins anymore. Of course Gith aren't affected by such weak magic.
Tempt me.
They're now aberrations from beyond known reality. Instead of thinking about these changes to humanoids in terms of just mechanical power, consider what these changes tell you about the world that D&D exists in. Your bard might easily influence the minds of the city guard, but if your party must bargain with the goblinoid fae, your approach needs to be much more considered. But in that case, how do you make humanoids formidable in your D&D campaign? There is a saying that the deadliest animal on Earth is a human being. Fantasy monsters are literal reflections of the horror humans unleash on each other. Find a motivation that would push a person to perform despicable deeds. Give them a stat block, and you've instantly got a villain who is, philosophically speaking, worse than any monster, because they don't have the excuse of being a blood-sucking vampire for their evil doing. The problem that fantasy falls into is depicting entire species as inherently and irredeemably evil, which is a very colonialism viewpoint, and it's also kind of boring at best. As discussed in our incredibly popular video about making bandits formidable, humanoid adversaries should be morally complex and nuanced. The Valican clans of Grimhollow raid the southern nations of Etheros to gather vital resources needed for them to survive the deadly winters of their home. And the elven Squire-Tell of The Witcher view themselves as fighting for the survival of their species, yet they slather folk with honey and leave them alive in the forest to be eaten by insects. Are either of these cultures or organizations inherently evil? Or are they even justified in the fear and warfare that they inflict on their enemies? That's up for your player characters to decide as they play through your campaign. But furthermore, neither the Valicans nor the Squire-Tell are entirely composed of a single fantasy species. There are dwarves that both fight against and fight for the Squire-Tell. And you can create humanoid cultures for your D&D campaign that are warlike, but also interesting and nuanced without the insulting notion that one species is entirely and inherently evil. You also don't need to fall into the trope of a warlike culture being depicted as tribal or living in darkness. Your villainous culture might hail from a powerful nation. I mean, Alexander the Great is one of history's greatest mass murderers. What if your D&D party fought against an invasion from a culture of heroic Crusader knights? Even then, you might make your villains more interesting by not making the entire nation irredeemably wicked. What is the cause of the conquest for these Crusader knights? Are they trying to extend the protection of their realm to places outside their own nation? Are they slaying monsters in the wilderness, but also capturing villages to ensure their own supply lines? Monsters. Ultimately, specific themes like the dangers of the wilderness are more fully explored by encountering true monsters like Fae or aberrations. Humanoid villains are better for exploring themes like the evil of humanity, which is never straightforward or one-sided. Nevertheless, let's build some humanoid villains for your D&D campaign. No orcs? No worries. As I mentioned, the D&D 2024 Monster Manual is actually brimming with humanoid stat blocks for creating interesting encounters and high-level villains. If we start simple, there are now 4 types of bandits. Standard bandit is basically the same as before, and the bandit captain is very similar as it was before, except now it has a flintlock pistol. But the bandit deceiver is a CR7 roguish archetype, able to cast illusory spells and throw a blinding flash, which can blind characters for the deceiver to escape from combat. The bandit crime lord is a CR11 version of the bandit captain, also with a scimitar and pistol, but with a rogue's evasion ability and a deadly aim feature to gain advantage on attack rolls. I guess they're going for a more highway rider gunslinger vibe with bandits, which is cool. The Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire also has the Outlaw stat block, which is kind of similar, and you can mix all of these stat blocks into combat encounters to build a criminal organization for your urban campaign. A Silco-like character could be your bandit crime lord, whilst you use the Gladiator stat block for the Savika-inspired enforcer, and a fiend cultist who hurls fiery explosions and hears voices could be Jinx. Speaking of the 7 cultist stat blocks, I could do an entire video on how to make cults formidable as villains in your D&D game, so leave a comment down below if you want that video. But the variety of cultists here really allows you to build a cult that suits your campaign, your needs. The Death Cultist is more like a necromancer. It inflicts necrotic damage and the frightened condition, while the Aberrant Cultist, meanwhile, is a master of the mind. It inflicts mental rot, which does psychic damage and leaves the target poisoned, and they have an ability to detect thoughts at will. Or perhaps your villainous humanoids are a militaristic nation, and your villain is a character like Ambessa from Arcane. Powerful, cunning, and determined. The Berserker Commander is a brutal stat block for inflicting high damage, and one that gets more powerful as the Berserker becomes bloodied in combat. The Questing Knight has more of a paladin vibe to it. It inflicts radiant damage and is immune to being frightened. It's more of that Crusader Knight feel like we were talking about earlier. But the Warrior Commander really embodies Ambessa's principles of strength. It deals high damage, but it also exhibits guile by forcing its enemies to make attack rolls with disadvantage, and it's able to make counterattacks as a reaction both in melee and at range. Remember, for all her despicable actions, Ambessa and the Warriors of Noxus were not all pure evil villains or monsters. She believed in the principles of safety through strength. Ambessa's motivations were clear, and the Noxans weren't merely a war-loving people because of their birth. Yet she was no less formidable as an adversary, despite her character in some ways being sympathetic. Humanoids should be the villain of your campaign specifically because you want to tell a morally complex story, not because you want cannon fodder for your party to chew up. Use undead or maybe monstrous gnolls in that circumstance. Or you can decide that orcs in your campaign setting are indeed monstrous, in which case you can still use the orc stat blocks from the 2014 Monster Manual because they're completely compatible with the new version of the game. Or you could use orc stat blocks from something like the Lord of the Rings 5e role-playing game, which is on D&D Beyond. If you just want your D&D game to be about fighting a traditional enemy like bandits and raiders, then you should watch this video about making bandits a formidable threat no matter what level your party is. Or if instead you want humanoid adversaries that are religious zealots intent on wiping out magic, then watch this video about making the Arcanist Inquisition the villains of your campaign.